At 4:12 in the morning on October 14th, 1959, the air at 19,000 feet does not just freeze your breath, it shatters it. Up here in the jagged throat of the Nangpa La Pass, the world is a monochromatic nightmare of black rock and blinding white ice. The wind screams at 60 miles per hour, a relentless horizontal gale that carries the fine, diamond-hard dust of pulverized glaciers. Most men, even the most hardened explorers, would find their lungs screaming for oxygen that isn't there. Their hearts would be hammering at 140 beats per minute just to keep their blood from turning into slush. But Tenzin Thaye was not most men. Tenzin sat in a crevice of dark granite, his body so still he looked like a natural extension of the mountain. He was 31 years old, a man who had spent the better part of 2 decades in the silent, incense-filled halls of the Thok Jalung monastery. He was a librarian by trade, a scholar of the ancient scrolls who knew the weight of a parchment and the subtle scent of aged ink better than the grip of a weapon. Yet there he was, perched on the edge of the world. His heart rate was a steady, rhythmic 40 beats per minute. Through the mastery of vase breathing, a secret technique of Tibetan yoga, he had turned his internal torso into a localized furnace. He wasn't shivering. He wasn't gasping. He was simply waiting. In his frost-covered hands, he cradled an object that looked like a piece of driftwood rescued from a shipwreck. It was a 1903 Lee Enfield short magazine rifle, a relic left behind by a British expedition decades ago. The wood of the stock was warped by years of Himalayan humidity and subsequent deep freezes. The iron sights were slightly misaligned, knocked askew by some forgotten impact long before Tenzin was even born. The bolt was stiff, complaining with a metallic groan every time it was cycled. To the modern military mind, it was a piece of junk. To Colonel Wei of the People's Liberation Army, who was currently leading a reinforced mountain battalion of 400 infantrymen up the slopes, it was a joke. Just 3 days earlier, Colonel Wei had encountered Tenzin during a clearing operation in the lower valley. Wei, a man who believed entirely in the dialectic of lead and steel, had looked at the monk and his rusted rifle and laughed. He called it an antique prayer stick. He mocked the monk, saying that Tenzin expected to stop the march of the future with a stick that belonged in the dirt. "Your gods are as obsolete as that iron," Wei had sneered, his voice amplified by the megaphone of his political officer. He told Tenzin to go back to his beads and his chants, for the revolution had no room for relics. Colonel Wei didn't realize that the man he was mocking had spent 20 years learning how to control every fiber of his being. He didn't know that Tenzin Thaye could slow his metabolism until he was practically a ghost, or that his eyes, trained by thousands of hours of reading microscopic script in dim candlelight, could track the movement of a snow leopard a mile away. Most importantly, Wei didn't realize that he had just given a man with nothing left to lose the ultimate reason to fight. The Nangpa La Pass is known as the Gateway of Ice for a reason. It is the only viable route for a heavy infantry battalion to reach the Thok Jalung monastery, where 800 years of sacred lineage scrolls are stored. If Wei's 400 soldiers crossed this pass, the scrolls would be burned to ash, and the survivors of the village below, those who had fled the initial shelling, would be trapped and executed. Tenzin was the only person left. The local Tibetan Resistance Council, a group of rugged Khampa warriors, had refused to help him. They looked at the soft-handed librarian and decided he was a liability. They wouldn't even waste a modern SKS rifle on him. "Your karma is too clean for blood, monk," their leader had told him before they were wiped out in a valley ambush. They left him with the Lee Enfield and 42 rounds of ammunition. 42 cartridges, many of them green with oxidation, kept in a small leather pouch that smelled of yak butter and old copper. The catalyst for Tenzin's transformation wasn't a political ideology or a sense of national pride. It was Pema. Pema was a 12-year-old boy, Tenzin's youngest disciple. He was the one who brought Tenzin his butter tea every morning at precisely 5:30. Pema was a child of the mountains who was famous for feeding the marmots and for his high-pitched, infectious laugh. He had just finished memorizing the Heart Sutra. During the initial PLA shelling of the lower village, a maneuver Colonel Wei called Precision Doctrine, a stray mortar shell had collapsed the tea house. Pema didn't die instantly. He died in Tenzin's arms, his small hands stained with the soot of the future Wei had promised. In that moment, The librarian didn't feel a surge of anger. He felt a profound, terrifying clarity. The non-violence he had practiced for 20 years wasn't a shield. It was a luxury that the children of Tibet could no longer afford. Now, as the first light of a bruised purple dawn began to bleed over the eastern peaks, Tenzin adjusted his position. He felt the frozen granite biting into his knees, but he acknowledged the pain and let it pass through him like water through a sieve. He looked down the pass. The PLA battalion was moving in a long, serpentine column. They were struggling. Even with their modern parkas and oxygen canisters for the officers, the altitude was ravaging them. At 19,000 feet, the air has only half the oxygen of sea level. Their lungs were filling with fluid. Their brains were swelling against their skulls in the early stages of high-altitude cerebral edema. They were staggering, their movements sluggish and uncoordinated. Tenzin reached into his pouch and pulled out one of the 42 rounds. He wiped the green oxidation off with the hem of his maroon robe. He felt the cold weight of the brass. He opened the bolt of the Lee Enfield, a slow, deliberate movement to avoid the sharp clack that might carry in the thin air. He chambered the round. The prayer stick was ready. He focused his gaze on the lead element of the column. He wasn't looking for a soldier. He was looking for a specific vibration in the air. He saw a young lieutenant, perhaps 20 years old, waving a signal flag to urge his men forward. The lieutenant looked exhausted, his face a pale shade of blue from hypoxia. Tenzin closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, reciting a silent prayer for the soul he was about to release. He wasn't killing out of hate. He was performing a grim, surgical necessity. In the world of high-altitude sniping, everything is a variable. The wind at this height doesn't just push the bullet. It tries to steal it. The air density is so low that the bullet travels faster and flatter than the ballistic tables suggest. Tenzin didn't have a ballistic computer or a rangefinder. He had his breath. He synchronized his heartbeat with the rhythm of the wind gusts. He felt the lull coming, a 3-second window where the gale would drop from 60 miles per hour to 20. He exhaled, emptying his lungs halfway, and held. His world narrowed down to the front sight post and the small bobbing figure of the lieutenant 500 yards away. To an untrained eye, the target was a speck. To Tenzin, it was the focal point of the entire universe. He squeezed the trigger, not with a jerk, but with a slow, meditative pressure, as if he were turning the page of a fragile, ancient manuscript. The Lee Enfield barked, a sharp, dry crack that was immediately swallowed by the vastness of the mountains. The recoil slammed into Tenzin's shoulder, a familiar bruising punch. Below, in the column, the lieutenant's head snapped back. He collapsed into the snow without a sound, the red of his life's blood steaming in the sub-zero air. For a moment, there was absolute silence in the pass. The soldiers stopped. They looked at their fallen officer, then at the towering, jagged cliffs surrounding them. They saw nothing but snow and rock. There was no flash, no smoke, and the sound had been so distorted by the echoes of the canyon that they couldn't tell where it had come from. Tenzin didn't wait to watch the confusion. He worked the bolt, the spent casing spinning into the snow with a soft hiss. He didn't move his body, only his eyes. He saw the sergeant major stepping forward, shouting orders, trying to restore discipline. Tenzin reached for his second round. He had 41 bullets left. He had 400 enemies. The math was impossible. But as Tenzin Thaye breathed in the freezing air, he knew that the mountain was on his side. The prayer stick had spoken, and for the first time in his life, the librarian was the one writing the story. The soldiers below began to scramble. They weren't elite mountain troops. They were conscripts from the lowlands of Sichuan and Anhui, men who had been told they were bringing liberation to a backward people. Now they were cold, they were suffocating, and they were being hunted by a ghost. Colonel Wei, safe in the middle of the column, screamed into his radio, demanding to know where the fire was coming from. But his soldiers couldn't answer. They were too busy staring at the red stains in the snow, wondering which one of them would be next. Tenzin watched them through the misaligned sights of his ancient rifle, his heart beating a slow, steady 40 times per minute. The war for the Nang Pala had begun, and the silence of the Buddha was about to become the deadliest weapon in the Himalayas. By 07:14 a.m., the Nang Pala Pass had transformed from a geographic obstacle into a slaughterhouse of the mind. The temperature had plummeted to -22 degrees Fahrenheit, and the air was so thin it felt like inhaling powdered glass. For the 400 men of the People's Liberation Army Mountain Battalion, the environment was a more immediate threat than any hidden monk. They were suffering from the early stages of high-altitude cerebral edema. Their brains, starved of oxygen, were beginning to swell against their craniums. Soldiers were stumbling, some vomiting clear fluid into the snow, others simply sitting down and refusing to move, their eyes glazed with the terrifying apathy of the dying. Colonel Way, standing near the center of the column, felt a dull, rhythmic throb behind his left eye, a warning sign of the altitude. He clutched his Type 54 pistol, his gloved fingers numb. He had sent scouts forward to find the source of the shot that killed his lieutenant, but the scouts were struggling to climb the 45-degree slopes. Every 10 steps required a minute of gasping for air. To Way, the antique prayer stick that had fired was an anomaly, a fluke of a dying resistance. He didn't realize that the monk above him was using the very air they were losing to turn himself into a ghost. Tenzin Thaye adjusted his position by exactly 4 inches to the left. He was now tucked behind a secondary shelf of slate, the dark gray stone providing a perfect camouflage for his maroon robes, which appeared black in the low, pre-dawn light. He felt a sharp, stinging sensation on his right cheek, where a sliver of ice had sliced the skin. He didn't wipe the blood. He let it freeze, sealing the wound. His focus was entirely on the mechanical failures of his weapon. The 1903 Lee Enfield was suffering. The extreme cold had caused the internal grease, applied decades ago, to thicken into a waxy sludge. Every time he worked the bolt, it felt like pulling a lever through heavy clay. Even worse, the warped wooden stock was beginning to walk the barrel. As the wood absorbed the microscopic moisture of his breath and then froze, it pressed unevenly against the iron, shifting the point of impact by approximately 5 inches for every 200 yards of distance. Tenzin knew this. He had spent the last hour observing the way the rifle behaved. He wasn't fighting the weapon, he was meditating with it, learning its flaws, and incorporating them into his calculations. He remembered Dorje, a 42-year-old Kampa warrior from the village of Kam. Dorje had been a man of iron, a veteran of a dozen skirmishes who had taught Tenzin how to clean the Enfield's bore with a pull-through made of yak hair. Dorje had been the one to mock Tenzin's soft hands, telling him that a library was a place to hide from the world, not to save it. Dorje was dead now, caught in a crossfire 3 weeks ago, his body left in a ravine because there was no time for a sky burial. Then there was Lobsang, only 29, a monk from Lhasa who had joined the resistance because he couldn't stand to see the scriptures burned. Lobsang had died not from a bullet, but from the mountain itself, his lungs filling with fluid until he drowned in his own chest while sleeping next to Tenzin. These men were the soldiers. Tenzin was just a librarian, but as he reached for his 3rd round, he realized that their deaths had left a vacuum that only he could fill. He smelled the faint metallic tang of the .303 cartridge, a mix of cordite and old brass. He tasted the salt of his own sweat on his upper lip. He heard the distant rhythmic clink-clink of PLA mess kits hitting their belts. If you want to see how the prayer stick of Tenzin Thaye fared against a battalion trained for mountain warfare, please hit the like button. It helps us share these forgotten stories of individual courage against impossible odds. And subscribe if you haven't already to ensure these heroes aren't lost to history. Returning to the frost-locked heights, the situation for the PLA battalion was about to go from desperate to catastrophic. Colonel Way ordered a 3-man mortar team to deploy. They were dragging a Type 31 60mm mortar, a weapon that weighed nearly 45 pounds. At this altitude, that weight felt like 400. The leader of the team, a corporal named Zhang Min, was 21 years old and hailed from the humid plains of Anhui. He was currently on his knees, gasping, his face a sickening shade of violet. Tenzin saw them through the misaligned iron sights. The mortar team was 580 meters away. If they managed to set up that base plate, they could rain high-explosive shells onto every crevice of the pass. Tenzin couldn't allow that. He compensated for the warped stock, aiming 6 inches high and 4 inches to the right of Jiang Min's chest. He felt the wind, a jagged, gusty crosswind that was currently blowing from the east at 35 miles per hour. He squeezed the trigger. Kill number 2. The 303 projectile, a 174-grain full metal jacket bullet, traveled at 2,400 feet per second. It struck the mortar baseplate first, a violent clang echoing through the pass, before ricocheting into Jiang Min's shoulder, spinning him around and throwing him face first into the ice. The mortar tube tumbled down the slope, sliding 300 meters until it vanished into a crevasse. "Sniper!" someone screamed below. The column dissolved into chaos. Soldiers began firing blindly into the cliffs. The sound was deafening, a jagged cacophony of Type 56 carbines and light machine guns. Thousands of rounds of 7.62 Ka 39mm ammunition were wasted, chewing up the granite hundreds of feet away from Tenzin's actual position. Tenzin didn't flinch. He lay flat, the smell of burnt powder from his own rifle lingering in his nostrils like a dark incense. A burst of machine gun fire stitched a line of holes in the snow just 3 feet to his right, showering him with ice crystals. He remained perfectly still. He was using the vase breath to keep his internal temperature stable, even as the wind tried to strip the heat from his bones. Then came the first near-death experience. A PLA marksman, a man with a scoped Mosin Nagant who had managed to maintain his composure, spotted the faint puff of vapor from Tenzin's previous shot. The marksman didn't shout. He simply adjusted his optic. Tenzin felt a sudden, intuitive prickle at the base of his neck, a survival instinct honed by years of silent meditation. He rolled to his left, a desperate, lunging movement. A split second later, a 7.62 Ka 54mm round slammed into the exact spot where his head had been. The impact was so violent it shattered a grapefruit-sized chunk of granite, sending a razor-sharp shard of stone into Tenzin's cheek. He felt the warm blood start to flow immediately, the heat of it a startling contrast to the frozen air. The bullet had missed his skull by less than 2 inches. Tenzin scrambled backward, his lungs burning. He was now out of his primary cover. He had to move, but moving at 19,000 feet was like running underwater. He felt the high-altitude cough beginning to tickle his throat, a deadly sign. If he started coughing, the vibration would give away his position instantly, and the fluid in his lungs would eventually kill him. He forced himself to swallow, using a mental visualization technique to calm the irritation. He looked at his leather pouch. 39 rounds left. Down in the pass, Colonel Wei was losing his mind. He had lost his lieutenant, his mortar team, and now his soldiers were starting to hallucinate. One private began screaming that the rocks were turning into demons. Another started disrobing, a classic symptom of terminal hypothermia known as paradoxical undressing. Wei realized that if he didn't clear the pass in the next 6 hours, he wouldn't have a battalion left to command. He ordered a human wave assault. "Fix bayonets!" Wei's voice cracked in the thin air. He pointed toward the western ridge where he suspected the sniper was hiding. "Forward! For the revolution! There is only one monk. Kill him and the monastery is ours." Tenzin watched as a wave of 50 soldiers began to scramble up the scree slope. They were slow, their movements clumsy, but they were numerous. They were coming from 3 different angles. This was the moment of the turning point. Tenzin knew he couldn't pick them all off one by one with a bolt-action rifle before they reached his position. He looked up, above his own position. There, perched precariously on the edge of the cliff, was a cornice, a massive overhanging eave of wind-blown snow and ice that had been building for the entire winter. It weighed perhaps 50 tons. It was held in place by nothing but friction and the sub-zero grip of the mountain. Tenzin remembered a passage from the Abhidharma, an ancient text on the nature of reality. It spoke of the interconnectedness of all things. He looked at the cornice, then at the charging soldiers, then at his rusted Lee Enfield. He had 39 rounds. He didn't need to kill 50 men. He needed to talk to the mountain. He shifted his aim away from the soldiers. He aimed at the base of the ice cornice at a specific hinge point where the ice met the rock. The sun was just beginning to hit that spot, creating a microscopic layer of meltwater that acted as a lubricant. Tenzin chambered around. He felt the cold iron of the trigger. He wasn't a monk anymore. He was a catalyst. He squeezed. Kill number 6 wasn't a man, it was a fracture. The .303 bullet struck the ice with a dull thud. Nothing happened. He worked the bolt, his movements a blur of practiced motion. He fired again, and again. 3 shots in 4 seconds. On the 3rd shot, the mountain answered. A sound like 1,000 dry bones breaking echoed through the pass. The cornice groaned. A hairline crack, thin as a spider's silk, appeared at the top of the ridge. Tenzin watched as the crack widened. The 50 tons of ice began to tilt. The soldiers below heard it too. They looked up, their hypoxic eyes widening in terror. They tried to turn, to run, but the scree slope was a trap. They slipped and fell, their bayonets clattering against the stones. Avalanche! The word was a death sentence. Tenzin pulled his maroon robe tight around him and pressed his body into a narrow vertical crack in the rock. He closed his eyes and began to chant the Heart Sutra, his voice a low hum beneath the roar of the falling mountain. The world went white. The sound was no longer a noise. It was a physical weight that pressed against his eardrums until they bled. The antique prayer stick had just triggered a force of nature that no Maoist doctrine could stop. At 14:22 p.m., the roar of the mountain finally died, replaced by a silence so absolute it felt like a physical pressure against the eardrums. The Nangpa La Pass was no longer a path. It was a graveyard of jagged white blocks and pulverized slate. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and the fine, crystalline dust of dry ice. Of the wave of 50 soldiers who had been charging up the slope, not a single one was visible. They were buried under 20 feet of compacted snow, for the remaining 350 men of the battalion stretched further down the pass. The world had just ended. Tenzin Thaye emerged from his vertical crevice like a shadow manifesting from the rock. His maroon robes were shredded, his right cheek was a mask of frozen blood, and his fingers were cracked from the sub-zero cold. But his eyes were clear. His heart rate remained at a steady, meditative 42 beats per minute. He looked down at the antique prayer stick in his hands. The wood was screaming with the stress of the cold, and the metal was frosted white, but it was still functional. He had 36 rounds left in his leather pouch, 36 pieces of brass to finish a war that had already cost him his soul. Colonel Wei was alive. Tenzin saw him through the misaligned iron sights, 480 meters below. Wei was standing atop a hummock of ice, waving his Type 54 pistol, his face a contorted mask of fury and haze-induced madness. He was screaming at his men to dig, to find the buried, to continue the assault. But the soldiers were no longer listening. They were staring at the ridge, waiting for the ghost to strike again. Among the survivors was Sergeant Major Yan, a 39-year-old veteran from Harbin who had survived the frozen hell of the Korean War. Yan was a man who understood the geometry of death. He knew that the avalanche wasn't an act of God. It was a calculated strike. He saw the puff of vapor from Tenzin's next shot before he heard the sound. Kill number 7. Tenzin didn't target a soldier. He targeted the battalion's primary radio set, carried by a young corporal standing inches from Colonel Wei. The .303 bullet smashed through the vacuum tubes and the battery casing of the heavy radio, sending a spray of sparks into the air. The corporal fell, not from the bullet, but from the shock of the explosion. The battalion was now deaf and mute. They could no longer call for air support or reinforcements. They were alone at 19,000 feet with a man who could talk to the mountains. Sergeant Major Yan attempted to rally a squad to flank the western ridge. He was a brave man, a father of 2 who had promised his wife he would return to the black soil of Manchuria. At 15:10 p.m., Yan took 3 steps into a narrow gully. Tenzin compensated for the 38-mile-per-hour wind, squeezed the trigger, and the .303 round entered Yan's chest, exiting through his spine. Yan died before he hit the snow. He was kill number 8. Tenzin felt a hollow ache in his chest with every pull of the trigger. Each life he took was a weight added to his karma, a stone that would pull him down into the lower realms of existence. But then he remembered Pima. He remembered the 12-year-old boy's laughter and the way the tea house had collapsed under the precision of the PLA mortars. He realized that his purpose was no longer to achieve enlightenment, but to be the shield for those who still could. By 16:45 p.m., the sun began to dip behind the western peaks, casting long, skeletal shadows across the pass. The temperature dropped to -35 degrees. Tenzin moved again, crawling through a tunnel of ice he had scouted weeks before while looking for rare mountain herbs. He was now only 200 meters from the center of the PLA column. He could smell the metallic tang of their weapons and the sour stench of their fear. He reached for his pouch. 29 rounds left. Colonel Wei was now hallucinating openly. He began firing his pistol into the air, screaming that the Buddha was a lie and that the mountain was a counter-revolutionary. His remaining officers tried to restrain him, but the discipline of the battalion had dissolved into a primal fight for survival. Soldiers were huddled together, their breath coming in ragged, wet gasps as their lungs continued to fill with fluid. Tenzin took kill number 9, 10, and 11 in rapid succession. The 3 highest-ranking NCOs left in the unit. He was decapitating the snake. With every shot, the Lee Enfield's bolt became harder to cycle. The metal was contracting in the extreme cold, the tolerances becoming so tight that Tenzin had to use the heel of his hand to slam the bolt closed. Then, the second near-death experience. A young conscript, hidden behind a supply crate, saw the movement of Tenzin's robe. The soldier fired a full magazine from his Type 56 carbine. The 7.62-meter rounds chewed into the ice shelf where Tenzin was perched. One bullet grazed Tenzin's left shoulder, tearing through the heavy wool and grazing the muscle. The shock of the hit nearly knocked the monk off the cliff. He slid 15 feet down a slick ice face, his fingers clawing at the frozen surface until he managed to wedge his boot into a crack. He hung there, suspended over a 300-foot drop, his rifle slung over his back. He didn't panic. He synchronized his breathing. He felt the cold iron of the mountain against his skin. He pulled himself up, inch by agonizing inch, his muscles screaming in the oxygen-starved air. When he reached the top, he didn't wait. He leveled the Enfield and took the conscript with a single shot to the throat. Kill number 12. The psychological war was over. The survivors of the battalion, seeing their comrades picked off by an invisible enemy they couldn't hit, finally broke. They began to retreat. It wasn't an orderly withdrawal. It was a rout. They abandoned their heavy equipment, their oxygen tanks, and their wounded. They ran back toward the lower valleys, their boots slipping on the blood-slicked ice. But Colonel Wei stayed. He was alone now, standing in the middle of a circle of corpses, his pistol empty. He looked up at the ridge. "Come down!" he screamed, his voice a pathetic rasp. "Show yourself, you feudal dog. Show me your god." Tenzin Thaye stood up. He walked to the edge of the cliff and looked down at the man who had mocked his prayer stick. Tenzin didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He reached into his pouch and pulled out the 42nd round. The final bullet. He chambered it. The bolt closed with a final, definitive clack. He aimed not at Wei's heart, but at the ground at the colonel's feet. He squeezed the trigger. The bullet kicked up a spray of ice, dusting the colonel's boots. Wei fell to his knees, sobbing. He realized that the monk had spared him, not out of mercy, but out of a deeper, more terrifying justice. Wei would have to live with the knowledge that his 400-man battalion had been dismantled by a single man with a rusted rifle. He would have to explain to his superiors how the future had been defeated by a relic of the past. Tenzin turned away. He didn't watch Wei crawl back down the pass. He walked toward the Tokjalung monastery. He arrived as the first stars were beginning to pierce the black velvet of the Himalayan sky. The monks were waiting for him. They had heard the shots. They saw the blood on his robes. Tenzin didn't enter the temple. He stopped at the threshold. He handed the Lee Enfield to the head librarian. "The scrolls are safe," Tenzin said, his voice sounding like dry leaves. "But I can no longer read them." He had saved the lineage. He had protected the 800 years of wisdom. But in doing so, he had become the very thing he had vowed never to be, a dealer of death. He knew that he could never sit in the meditation hall again. The ghosts of the 42 men he had killed would always be there, sitting in the shadows. Tenzin Thaye left the monastery that night. He walked higher into the mountains, toward a cave he had found years ago. It was a place of absolute silence, where the wind couldn't reach. He would spend the rest of his life there, in a silent retreat, seeking forgiveness for the lives he took to save 1,000. The People's Liberation Army never officially acknowledged the battle at Nang Pala. In their records, the battalion was lost to a natural disaster, a massive avalanche caused by extreme weather conditions. There is no mention of a monk or a 1903 Lee Enfield. But the locals know. They still tell the story of the Librarian of the Ice, the man who used the silence of the Buddha to stop an army. If this story touched you the way it touched us, do us a favor, hit the like button. Every like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell. We are rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every day. Stories about people who proved their worth with skill and courage. Real people, real heroism. Leave a comment now and tell us where you are watching from. Are you watching from the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, or Australia? Our community spans the entire world. You are not just a viewer. You are a part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if anyone in your family served. Just let us know you are here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for ensuring that Tenzin Thaye does not disappear into the silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you are helping to make that happen. The scrolls survived because of one man's sacrifice, and today, his story survives because of you.